Snow kept its own counsel when it fell at Winterfell. It hushed the bustle of the outer ward and erased the prints of boots, fox, and boy alike, and it made a clean quiet around the old stones that had known too many voices. Bran Stark had come to understand that quiet as a kind of speaking. When the flakes drifted without wind, the keep itself listened. In that listening, a boy who could no longer run felt the world draw near. He woke to the smell of wood smoke and the small creak of timbers settling in the cold. A feather of frost uncurled along the iron of his bedstead, fine as threads on a lady's cuff. His legs were there under the quilts, but that was a lie his eyes told him. His legs were far away and numb as the bones of last year's sheep. He pushed the thought aside with a stubborn impatience that had belonged to him long before any fall. Summer's weight lay across the rushes near the bed, heavy head on heavy paws, breathing the slow breath of a sleeping hunter. The direwolf's ears flicked toward the door, then flattened again, content with whatever he had scented on the other side. "Hotter," Bran called, and though he meant to sound strong, the name came out softer than he intended, as if spoken into a glove. The oaken door was already cracked. Hotter pushed it wider with his shoulder, ducking his great head as if it could ever hope to clear a lintel. He smiled with all the simplicity of sunshine through thin cloud. "Hotter, I want the god's wood," Bran said, and Hotter's smile faltered at once, as if scolded. Maester Luwin did not approve of god's woods. He approved of ledgers and letters, of binding wounds and binding boys to lessons, of rational shapes stacked neatly in the mind. The god's wood was an untidy place in every way a maester disliked. Bran liked it because of that, because the wind there forgot to whisper of obligations, because the pool held sky and leaf in its black mirror, because the heart tree knew his name in a way that did not need tongues. "Hotter," Bran repeated gently, "before the maester wakes." Hotter looked not at Bran but at the direwolf. Summer's eyes opened and found Hotter's, amber to brown, and held them there. Something passed between them that had nothing of language in it, and then the big man nodded as if a committee had been convened and the motion carried by a narrow margin. He stepped forward, wrapped Bran in the thick cloak by the bed, and lifted him. He had learned to think of himself in two pieces, the part that went where Hotter carried it, and the part that went where Summer ran. The first part took the corridor with its tapestries of gray betweens and blue fields, took the chill that found the seams of his cloak, took the turn past the smoky warmth of the kitchens where early fires had already been laid. The second part took the scent of hair in the courtyard, of meat in a wooden bowl, of horse sweat and cracked leather and the faint hot iron smell that clung to Micken's forge. The two pieces overlapped sometimes, blurred, then separated again, like reflections in rippled water. By the time Hotter pushed open the heavy door to the god's wood, the morning was only a few breaths old. A thin blue lay over the snow. The air had that precise winter clarity that made every distant sound, branch creak, crow call, seem close. The god's wood did not mind the snow. It collected in cupped leaves, perched on the weirwood's red hands, softened the path to the pool into a line of shallow bowls. The heart tree rose upon its little knoll like a thing that had stopped halfway between growing and thinking. "Put me down," Bran said. "By the roots." Hotter squatted and set him where the weirwood's white roots loosened the earth and tasted the pool. The bark was smooth and cold under Bran's palm, almost like ice but not. It had a warmth that was not temperature. He leaned his head and let that not cold, not warm seep into his ear. Snow dusted his hair. Summer padded to the far side of the knoll and stood with muzzle lifted, sampling the air as if it were thick with things he could only half smell. Sometimes the gods would spoke easily. On days when the ravens came brazen and noisy, on days when sun flashed along the pool in 1,000 knives, Bran would rest his hand here and the world would open like a book thumbed by a hurried reader. Other mornings demanded patience. The tree knew patience. Bran breathed with it. He let the restlessness that had chased him from his bed slide off him and down into the world's slow places, the valleys under ice where water moved without sound. Maester Luwin said that dreams were only a mind's way of mending rips. He said that crows did not carry words, only habits. He said that however much Bran loved his wolf, A boy who loved a dog did not become a dog. But the heart tree remembered before language, and when Bran set his cheek to its pale skin, he heard things older than words. He heard bark settle over wound. He heard sap thicken. He heard leaf all at once and one by one. A sound came, thin as a knife point drawn along his inner ear. Not a sound. A bell. There was nothing of bells in Winterfell's Godswood. The bell swung far to the south, in a city that did not wear snow kindly, and its note had been thinned by distance and heated air, by being struck by a different kind of wind. Bran did not hear it with his ears. Came by another way, along roots and waters, along the secret places old things still shared. The bell's tongue touched him and made his own tongue know the shape of the name it spoke. Baelor, it said, which was a place and a statue and a memory and a warning all together. Bran drew his head back. Snow fell from his hair in a little shrug. Hotter, he said, but Hotter was humming where he crouched on the edge of the path, happy to be comfortable in one of the few places a man his size could sit without being told to mind his elbows. The bell came again. Baelor. It had a weight to it, as if the ringing itself had been hammered in some smithy where events were forged, and the smith had meant this blow to be a failing of metal. What is it? Bran whispered into the bark. The heart tree did not answer in a way that could be taken down and read aloud, but something of the older quiet shifted. He felt it as he sometimes felt the approach of storm, an indefinable pressure that made the hairs on his arms lift. He closed his eyes and let the feeling take him. Let the gods would slide away as if a curtain had blown in a strong draft. Let the world turn and rethread around another place. Heat rose like a different weather. Smells shouldered one another, thick and complicated. Tallow, horse, wine gone sour in a cup. The stale sweetness of incense where it had laid on stone. Breath from mouths that had eaten garlic. The sky was a whitewashed glare. He knew none of these things with his own nose. He knew them with the memory of every beak that had known them before. He was on a roof lip. Beneath him a square was filling like a basin. Cloths of bright color moved upon people as if they were banners that grew legs. Guards glittered. This close to the sea, the air had an undernote of salt that made his tongue want to taste water. A shadow cut the glare as a wing opened above him. A raven landed at his side, claws clicking on the stone, head canted. Another lofted from a cornice opposite. Another crossed from a bell tower where the bell that had rung for Baelor slept heavy and inert. Their eyes found him with a bird's hard attention and then slid off as if he were no more than a shape of heat. He reached, not with hand, and felt the mind of the nearest like the inside of a small room. Simple, full of sharp hooks of desire, lit by peck, by balance, by air. In that small room was a window that faced the square. He stepped through it and stood where there could be no standing. A figure kneeling on the platform at the square's heart. An old name and a father's name in one. The heat made the man's hair look darker. Men in white cloaks, men in red cloaks, a boy on a seat with a narrow face and a mouth that liked to make announcements. Down below, a girl whose braid had come crooked. A second girl somewhere he could not see. The executioner's sword leaned against the stair, and a man with a face like stone where speech had been carved out long ago stood beside it with the patience of a piece of furniture waiting to be moved. Bran flinched. The flinch lived entirely in the place where his heart beat. His body at Winterfell did not move. A cold line traced his spine that had nothing to do with north. He did not know what he could do, but the bell had found his name and the godswood had sent the bell, and when he had to choose between a thing that could not be done and a thing that would not be done, he chose as Stark men had always chosen when there was snow on the ground. He chose to try. The raven's mind was easy once he accepted its shape. It lived near. It did not consider consequences. It could be turned like a horse that had been handled often by the same steady hand. But he had no steady hand and no often, only fear and a love that he would not have thought to call love until this moment when it pressed under his ribs so hard he could not breathe. He pushed, and the bird leaped hard into air with a croak that brought heads up all around the rooftop. After the first, the others were easier. The birds were a tendril. Somewhere below and to the east, above a granary roof, A flock that had been disputing a piece of cloth in the gutter turned as if set upon by a wind at ground level. Ravens crossed and recrossed, their shadows moving like a net over the bright square. He drew more from the north, from the rookery of a September where they were not supposed to nest, from the rafters of a wine shop where the owner swore at them every morning. The city had learned to live with ravens as it had learned to live with other ugly necessities. Today the city would find that some necessities had teeth. The boy on the seat said something Bran could not hear with any real ears. The old man lifted his head. Another bell rang somewhere, not Baylor's but a bell of warning or marking time, and the ringing made the ravens stutter in their flight for a moment as if they were pages in a book thumbed too quickly. He held them in the air with the focus of a boy trying not to drop a glass goblet. He thought without words, now. And when the executioner took up the sword and lifted it to be admired by the sun, the air above the platform thickened suddenly, as if a cloud had decided to live there. A single bird would have been swatted aside. 10 would have been impressive and doomed. Hundreds drew a new shape of space over a man with a sword in his hands. The first raven struck the executioner's shoulder. The second took spent flight against his jaw. The third came with claws at the soft corner of an eye, and though Bran took no joy from the sensation, a jag of satisfaction flickered through him when the man staggered and hissed. The sword teetered. White cloaks moved. Red cloaks shifted late. The boy on the seat's mouth opened, and in the hot bright square his words were snatched away by the beating of wings. The platform swayed with the sudden redistributions of weight. A white-cloaked man stepped wrong, his boot heel finding the edge of a board that had been laid hurriedly yesterday under a carpenter's impatient eye. He went down and took another with him. The ravens surged, a tide that had never learned how to be still. Claws found cheek, ear, mouth. Birds drove their weight into faces, and when they were knocked aside they returned, as simple in their anger as a hammer returning to a nail. In the crowd, someone shouted, the sort of shout that begins as one man's fear and then finds it has company. The square became several squares, each moving at odds with the other. A woman fell. The men behind her stepped on her skirt and dragged at her along without seeing. A baker used his basket like a shield. The burn-scarred knight tried to push toward the platform. The ravens disliked him with a particular intensity that Bran did not send and could not have stopped if he had tried. They flung themselves toward the bright lick of torch he had taken from a trembling boy. The torch guttered and went briefly out. Where it ought to have burned steadily, a jagged plume of black smoke rose. The knight swore and swatted. Blood trickled from his scalp where a talon had found thin skin. The words of the boy king came again, high, impatient. His voice was a child's voice, and his commands were precisely made but turned to shreds in the air where wings were. Someone else had planned for a quiet death. Someone else had ordered the carpenters and the guards and the places where the carts would be allowed to halt. Bran had not planned for any of it. He had names and a bell and the stubborn wish of a boy. He clung to the minds of his birds the way a drowning man clings to a rope that has frayed but still supports. A shape gentled itself out of the chaos at the edge of the platform. A man in rough wool, a black badge like a crow stitched to his breast. He carried no sword, only a staff that had seen many miles. His eyes flicked up to the ravens, and he did not flinch. He moved with decision and without hurry as the crowd's panic curled and snapped around him. When the white cloaks lurched, he found the gap they had made. When the executioner swore and turned his face away, the man with the staff was at the old man's side and had his shoulder under his arm. "Up," he said, and Bran did not know how he knew that word, except that it was the sort of word men always used when there was a thing that had to be done and not enough time to do it in. Ned Stark had bent his head to an outcome he did not choose. His body had grown strangely light. He had been holding his breath without knowing it. At the first blow of wings, he had felt not hope but confusion, which is a small cousin of hope and can be mistaken for it by those who have not had cause to know the difference. When the man with the staff slid under his weight, he did not have to choose. His body answered the imperative of being helped with an immediacy that startled him. Pain roared through his leg where bone had been made to remember itself. He gasped and was furious at himself for the sound. Not far, the man said, and that was a lie, but necessary lies have been used to move hurt men before. The step down from the platform was a tremendous country. Between one plank and the earth stood a wall of wings. Bran could taste the air of it, feathers and frantic heat. He pushed his birds this way and that, herded them like small agile cattle. Through brief clearings he saw a girl's face lifted, mouth open to scream that was not sound at all but an animal noise pretended at civility. Another face, pale, dark hair, a mouth that had learned how to show nothing. The pale girl had eyes that were not seeing. The dark-haired girl had vanished. For one breath Bran thought of his own sisters, and the thought was like stepping into a stream in spring when it runs cold and carries the memory of mountain stone. Below and out of sight of the platform, the streets emptied themselves of people who had no wish to be part of someone else's story. The man in rough wool and his burden moved into an eddy the city had provided, a place where two alleys quarreled and left a bit of quiet between them. Two more men were there, the kind you do not notice until they have taken hold of your elbow. They hauled Ned into shadow as tenderly as men whose trade is brutality know how to be tender. The rough-wool man took the time to lay his cloak over shoulders that had known better cloaks. "Have you lost a daughter?" he asked without preface. Ned's mouth tried two answers and settled on the one that cost less to say. "No," he lied, tasting what it cost. He did not add that there was no losing and finding where his girls were concerned. They were either held under his gaze or they lived in a kind of air where he could not breathe. "Then keep your feet," the man said. "The crows have bought a little time. I'd not like to owe them more." Bran felt something then that he had no word for. Not pride. He disliked the swell of it when it came to him, even before his fall, but a rightness like the last stone placed on a wall that has threatened to list all afternoon. He held his flock to their work. The boy on the seat had finally managed to make words land. His commands began to sharpen. Archers raised bows. You could not shoot a storm. They tried. Birds fell out of the air with stiff wings and slow spirals, and the sight made Bran flinch again and redouble. He sent the ones that remained to the rooftops. He drew them back and sent them in again. He made the cloud thicken where the white cloaks tried to force a clean avenue through the chaos. When the burn-scarred knight pushed near enough to swing his sword toward the man with the staff, 3 birds struck the back of his knee in succession and his leg faltered. He did not go down. He was a man who did not fall when the world asked him to. He turned to cut at what he could not see. The air filled with his curse and the sharp breath of his frustration. A hand took Ned's wrist and yanked him through a doorway that had been left ajar so often that its hinges had learned to do what was asked of them without complaint. Inside, stairs. He went with them because he could not go. His legs spoke to him in a steady, unpleasant voice. The room at the top smelled of onions and soap, and a woman there stared at them with a ladle in her hand until the man in rough wool pressed coin into that hand without a word. Her mouth shut accordingly. They crossed to another door that did not look like a door. It opened to a narrow, dry channel that ran along the inside of the wall. Rats fled them as if they were nobles in some court of rodents, scattering in panic and confusion. The men did not hurry. They moved with the practiced slowness of men who have learned how to pass unseen in a place that sees too much. Varys waited in a cellar that kept peaches during summer. There were no peaches now. The smell of them held on nonetheless, the way laughter leaves a mark in a room where it has lifted and gone. He stood with his hands folded in a way that made them look like someone else's hands. When he saw the men descend, a single breath went out of him and his shoulders dropped the frost they had carried all morning. "You've ruined my hour," he said mildly to the man with the staff. The man shrugged. "Your hour looked a poor thing from where I stood." "Yes," Varys admitted. "It did." He turned to Ned Stark, and the careful lines around his eyes deepened. "My lord," he said softly. "No, not lord, not today. Forgive me. You must forgive me everything." Ned reached for pride, found pain instead, and set both aside because there was work to do. He did not ask the questions he might have asked on a day when questions were a luxury he could afford. He tasted the cellar's damp and the memory of fruit and knew he had crossed into a coil of plans he had not made. My daughters, he said. One is hidden and has been since dawn, Varys replied. One is where she must be to make this possible. This will not hold unless someone believes you died today. The words opened like an ache in Ned's chest that was not of bone. Is there no other way? There is always another way, Varys said in the tone of a man delivering a merchant's honesty. It is worse. Ned closed his eyes. The memory of hot sun lay across his lids. Somewhere not far, the city still shouted. Somewhere very near, a rat gnawed delicately at a peach pit and went still when he realized he had an audience. Do what you will, he said at last. Only, if there is one kindness left in the world, let it be to my girls. Of course, Varys said, and meant it, and also meant other things that did not have room to stand beside that first meaning. He turned his head. Yoren, the man with the staff, Yoren, grunted. You go with him, Varys said to Ned. You are a dead man today. Men will see what they expect to see. If we shave your head and take your name from you for a short time, the wall will give you a road no man else would grant you. Night's watch, Yoren said, and the last word sat in the cellar like an iron weight on a silken cushion. We go to gather boys. I can gather a man as well. Bran held the birds together until his mind ached. Every wing beat thudded in a place where, in the godswood, heartbeat and sapbeat had fallen into the same rhythm. When at last the men in white recommitted to their line and the raven's ferocity grew ragged and unfocused, he drew them off. He let them find the perch and the roofline and the gutter. He let his breath come back into his lungs at Winterfell. His hand had stuck to the bark, wet with melting snow. When he tried to take it away, the skin on his palm stung and left a faint print where it had been. Hodder made a worried sound. It took him a moment to remember that the sound was for him, not for the wolf. Summer was standing very still now, watching him with the intensity that had flowed across the raven's eyes a moment ago. In their shared room of thought, there was the hint of blood and excitement and a whimper he did not let become a whine. Bran reached and put his hands into the wolf's thick fur and held on. He did not tell Maester Luwin what he had done. He did not tell old Nan, who would have believed him too easily and told him too much. He did not tell his mother, though he wanted most to run to her with the story of a thing he had made happen in a city he had never seen with his own eyes. The godswood had never asked for words. He made an offering in the old way because something in him understood the debt that had just been incurred. He pressed his thumb into the cut of his palm until the blood rose and smeared it against a root that had twisted itself out of earth like a pain that someone had learned to live with. The blood went dark and sticky and then vanished into the white. Who are you speaking to? A voice asked behind him, light and odd, as if it had traveled a long way to find itself in this sentence. Bran turned, but no one stood by the path. Hodder's humming had fallen away. Snow drifted thicker. The voice had been inside his head as the bell had been, but it had not come from a place known to the heart tree. Not now, he said aloud to the air that had spoken, and if that was foolish, it was also something he could not help. In the great hall, the day broke like a spill of warmed ale over cold stone. Maester Luwin's chain gleamed. Robb read a letter with knuckles whitening. Catelyn could not still her hands. Each one found the other and tried to keep it quiet. It had been all marching and messengers, all hope stapled to strategy, all names pushed around a map as if men were tokens. Bran let the noise fall around him like a cloak. Summer's presence at his knee soaked into him. The wolf's patience ran under the words like a low river. A letter, Robb said, coming down the steps two at a time, which he had learned to do as a child to show he was not the slow sort of boy. His face had become a place where boys' expressions came to die. He held the parchment as if it had heat. From the south. He did not finish the sentence. Catelyn's hand had found his wrist and taken it, not to comfort so much as to share the burn. Something in the set of her shoulders betrayed a memory of the sound a sword makes when it leaves a scabbard and does not look back. Bran's gaze found the ink despite himself, the way a tongue finds the place where a tooth used to be. His eye caught the crooked start of a line he did not read with his mind. He knew its content. He had stitched some of it himself, feather by feather. He saw the spot where the sender's hand had trembled, a tremor hidden even from the man who had written it. Varys's hand could mask a lie. It could not mask the old ache of a man who had used all his pity long before and had found some stale draft of it left at the back of the cupboard. "The hand of the king," Robb said, each word like a stone being placed. "Our father." Catelyn had not let go of his wrist. She folded the letter around it, as if enclosing the bone in citation could keep it from breaking. "Say it," she said, and if ever a woman loved honesty, she hated it in this moment. "He died today on the steps of Baelor September," Robb said. The sentence hung in the air on a taut little wire. Those who knew how to hold themselves held. Those who did not let out their grief like doves frightened out of a dovecot. Bran did not make a sound. He felt a peculiar looseness inside. He did not think it was shock. It was an odd, private relief at discovering that the work of lying was now someone else's, and he could set down the weight of knowing a truth that would not help anyone if carried openly. The relief did not last. It gave way to a heavier thing. Later, when men had gone to sharp words and sharper plans, he found his mother in the long window where light came in like clear wine. She had not moved for an hour. Her face had arranged itself carefully. Grief was a craft in her hands, but love had always been the better craft, and over the years it had made the grief tool dull. "Mother," Bran said. Catelyn looked down at him as if she were looking across a river she had not meant to cross. Her hand reached for his hair, and despite all that had changed, he resented the gesture because he did not want to be the child she remembered. Then her fingers stopped halfway and dropped to her side because she remembered too. She remembered that a boy can be fierce about his head being touched when there are other indignities he must suffer calmly. "I heard the bell," Bran said, and she closed her eyes. "What bell, my sweet?" "Baelor's," he said, because lies had already moved into their house today, and he did not wish to add another. "The gods would." There was a bell. Came up the roots. "It made me think of father." She pressed her lips together as if to stop something escaping. "Don't," she said, and he could tell that she had meant to say more but decided against it. Not because she did not believe him, but because belief would hurt. Maester Luwin came that afternoon with his chain in his hands, as if he might offer it up and ask for a different profession. "Bran," he said, not unkindly, "I've heard from Hodder that you were in the Gods' Wood at dawn. Your mother is not herself today. Do not go making her mind uneasy with talk of bells." "But there was a bell," Bran said. He watched Luwin's face the way a harpist watches his strings for flaws. The maester's mouth did that little twitch it did when he was trying to flatten a wrinkle in a topic with a book. "There was a raven," Luwin corrected gently. "Ravens have cleverness enough to seem like bells if we wish them to be. Ravens, I will grant you, bring us words that we put into them. Bells do not. You are a good boy, Bran. Be a good boy today and take your lessons." Bran stared at the stones of the floor. He did not want to tell this man that he had sent the ravens, because to tell was to wave something delicate under a man who liked to be careful with delicate things but who had never learned the kind of care that is needed for living feral delicacy. "Very well," Bran said. He bent his mouth around the shape of obedience as if it were a bitter herb, and Luwin, hearing what he wanted to hear, left comforted. Yoren cut Ned's hair in a kitchen where no one would think to look for a lord. Hair fell in tired clumps. The man who had lost the smell of peaches from his hands swept in efficient motions, and for each sweep he was paid twice what he had been paid for all of last month's sweeping. Ned felt each tug and pull as an affront to a dignity he had thought himself long weaned off, and was ashamed of himself for the thought. He had agreed to don this other skin. He could not resent the ways in which it fit poorly. "I will see them," he said as the knife rasped close to scalp. "My daughters." Varys did not look at him for a moment and thus did not have to signal his face into the arrangement he used when he needed to tell a harsh truth as if it were a soft one. "One will have to be left where she is," he said. "That is the price of any of this working at all. The other, if you do not look with a father's eyes, you may find her where she should not be when the wagons leave tomorrow. I have no doubt that if a certain boy appears among the recruits, no one will think to count how many of the boys are really boys. Yoren muttered something that could have been a laugh buried in a cough. "I can't keep him from hidin' in my barrels," he said, and the corners of his mouth turned up enough to make the remark into permission. "When you reach a road where you are empty of certainty," Varys said, "follow Yoren. He has this one gift over all of us. He knows where he is going. The wall is one of those places that cannot be mistaken for any other place." "My name?" Ned asked. The sound of it had grown large in his head since the scaffold. Not name exactly, but the idea of name, the way a man carries his sense of himself on his shoulders and sometimes accuses the weather of being heavier than it is. "You will leave it," Varys said, "just for a while. It will be looked after in your absence. It has done me little good of late." "Names are like swords," Varys said. "Better to have one and know its balance than to borrow some other thing and hope to cut well." He reached into his sleeve and brought out a strip of leather with a little iron token at its end. "This is all the name you will need, a black CI. Berkeley, there are men who will open doors when they see it, and men who will choose to look away entirely. For both kinds we are grateful." Ned took it. It looked like nothing. He closed his fingers and found the iron's coolness a comfort in the way a man's hand can take comfort from a nail he knows exists, even if he cannot see it in the dark. "What happens now to what will people see?" he asked. "Another man's end," Varys said softly. "It is an ugly truth that the city can be made to eat what you put in its mouth if you season it with prompting and fear. No one wants to believe the world is more complicated than the story they have already chosen. You will be given a different ending than the one you were promised this morning. That is the most I can do with the tools I have." "And the boy?" Ned said, the shape of the word like a barb. He meant the boy on the seat. He could not say the name with love or hate. He could not say it without adding things to it that would make it too heavy for his tongue. "He will sit his seat and think himself king. Boys who think themselves kings are dangerous as men who think themselves gods," Varys replied. "But I am a small man and I move small things. Today I have moved a few. Tomorrow I will move a few more. It is the business of kings to imagine the business of others to be small. It is the business of men like me to let them." Ned lifted his hand and found his head bare and strange. He had always worn his hair like a banner of his house because he had never imagined it could be used as a path by which someone might come to harm him. He rubbed the sharp new stubble as if it belonged to someone else and he had taken it in his hand to return it. "Very well," he said. That night, Winterfell's sky went hard and clear, and stars stood out like nails driven into black wood. Bran could not sleep. He could not have named what kept him awake. It was not fear that had done its work and gone to sit in a corner and sharpen itself. It was not triumph that had never belonged to him. He thought of the city's heat with an odd longing, as if the press of strangers could keep you warm on a night when the world itself breathed cold. Summer rose and took his nose to the seam at the bottom of Bran's door, then turned to look at him in that way that suggested the wolf was as patient a nursemaid as any in the keep. Bran's hands already knew the pattern without telling. Cloak, the line of his legs strapped in a way that did not ask them to remember what to do. Hodder's low murmur at being woken again. The corridor, the stair. He did not have to ask to be taken back toward the godswood. Hodder's feet turned there as if drawn. The heart tree had gathered more snow in its red hands. It looked down without reproach. Bran pressed his palm again to its skin and felt, with a start he did not let escape a sound, the answering touch not of the thing in the trunk, but of something that spoke from the spaces between trunks. It was like a face seen through water. It was old. He did not think it was entirely friendly. "You took," it said. The words came without language. He heard them with the part of him that had followed birds. "You called and they came and you took." "I asked," Bran said, and even as he spoke he heard the foolishness of insisting on a difference. There were asking that were taking, and he had done one of those. "We will have something when it is time," the old voice said. It did not speak in threat, and the lack of threat in it made it more terrible than any promise of hurt. "What?" he whispered. "Something," the voice answered, which was the truth as a tree knows truth. "Not now. Now go and be a boy." He wanted to laugh at that. He did not. Recognizing a mercy is the first lesson given to children in houses where winter is a regular guest. He bowed his head to the old thing that had granted him a mercy it had not had to grant. When the recruits for the wall gathered, it was done with as little ceremony as could be managed by men who had no taste for ceremony and less coin for its food. Boys with narrow chests and new mouths hurried after older men with scars. Thieves carried their theft in the set of their shoulders. One or two had the blank look of Westermen who had chosen the black in a mood and would curse it for the rest of their lives. Yoren moved among them like a shepherd. His staff took on the nature of a staff. He called them crows who were not crows, and they came. The streets were not friendly like he knew them. Stone had a different intention today. He felt the city watching, as if it disliked the thought of someone slipping away with something it had been promised to devour. Ned walked at Yoren's shoulder and did not limp until it was impossible not to. If anyone looked at him, they saw a man who had slept on stone too often and drank too little ale to soften the edges. Varys had smudged his face with something that made him look wan. He wore the black disc under his collar as if it were a small moon to keep him from being lost at sea. At a wagon stacked with casks, a small shape slid out from between two staves and landed on bare feet in the dirt with a soft thump. Yoren did not look at her. This was important, he said, loud enough to be heard by any who expected to hear exactly such things. "Keep up, boy." And the girl made herself a boy in the way that only a person with a very specific courage can. Her hair had been hacked badly. Her face had been smeared badly. She carried herself not badly at all. She fell in at the rear of the dark line and tucked her chin. When they passed the onion cellar, a rat darted across their path and was crushed under a cartwheel, and somehow that felt like prophecy, though of what none of them could say. When they passed the bell of Baelor's lofty tower, it swung slightly though there was no wind, and if anyone thought to note it, they kept the thought to themselves. In the Red Keep, a woman stood, with her hands on the marble of a window casement, as if she could wring out of the stone a consolation she would never extend to others. Her mouth was very small, pursed down to the point where she might have bitten it off if the impulse had come to her. At her shoulder, a man in green moved a finger along the cloth of his sleeve, as if smoothing imaginary dust were the same as smoothing reality. "How did you not plan for birds?" she asked him without looking. "How does one plan for birds?" he returned. "You can plan for men. You can plan for steel. Birds are not amenable to arrangements." She turned then, and her eyes were hot enough to make the cool of the marble seem like a thing the room had been granted in desperation. "I had an arrangement." "So did I," Peter Baelish said, smiling his little smile that had more arithmetic in it than warmth. "We will make another. Arrangements breed like vermin if you keep a warm place for them." He lifted a hand. "Do not say the name. It is an ugly name. It makes the tongue feel like it is rowing through tar." "Say it," she insisted. "Magic," he said lightly, as if speaking the word could keep the thing it named small. She made a dismissive sound in her throat and then did not dismiss it. "If someone thinks they can make me dance with that on their fingertips, they will learn I have teeth." "You have teeth," he agreed suavely, while cataloging the new shapes of danger. He had never loved birds. They made air out of decisions. They unmasked the story you had written and called it a scribble. He did not like scribbles. He made a note to send a certain woman who sold candles a set of coins tied with a ribbon. Men who could not be bought could be moved nearer to the money they already had and watch what happened to their principals. Birds could not be bought. He did not know what to do with that. Night fell on the road north like an instrument being put back into its case. Stars came cold and steady. The wagons creaked. Boys tried not to cry because if they cried the men would remark upon it, and if the men remarked upon it then the crying would be useless. Yoren walked as if night were old and uninteresting. Behind him moved a man whose head felt suddenly too light for his neck. Beside that man moved a child whose heart beat a staccato too quick to be sustainable. No one said the names of things aloud. Names were weapons, and it is foolish to draw a weapon before you can see your enemy. Bran slept at last, but sleep had learned to wander. The path it took carried it to a river and a line of wagons. He saw through eyes that were not eyes. He saw the flit of a mouse in the straw of a cart bed. He saw the shape of a girl curled into the curve of a barrel. He saw a man's hand grip a staff and not loosen. He saw another hand, pale where hair had been, and he felt something move in him like a ship shifting its ballasts. He tried to follow. The dream thinned. He woke with his heart hammering, and the first thing he saw was Summer's eyes, which had in them the midnight light of the Godswood pool and also a kindness that had never belonged to any tree. In Riverrun, at a parapet where wind went sharp, Caitlin stood with a letter and did not let it go. Her father's house tower rose from the river like a stubborn thought. Somewhere below, men were washing harness in water that had cooled past the comfort of hands. Robb spoke to her and she heard him and did not. There is a kind of hearing that happens only with the face turned away. She had received another letter that night, one that did not travel by raven. It had arrived folded into a loaf of bread a kitchen girl had baked without understanding the burden of the thing it carried. It did not say "I live." It did not say "I am coming." It said only that if a woman stood any chance of seeing one of her children again without chains on her wrists, she would not take the chance away with a cry. She was not a woman who cried where the record could consider it. "Mother." Robb touched her sleeve. He was careful not to say what men around them were saying. "King, North, vengeance." He said, "We go at dawn. Will you bless me?" Caitlin inclined her head and then laid her hand upon his hair, not because she believed blessings traveled so, but because this was the language he had known from the cradle, and that language does not fail you unless you give it permission. "Whom will you trust?" she asked. "When you reach the neck?" "Lord Reed," Robb said. "You can trust Reeds," she said, and her mouth made something like a smile because jokes that come like that, quiet and from the old places, are a kind of prayer. They bend. Everything else thinks bending is the same as breaking. It is not. "I will bend and not break," Robb said with young certainty. "Wood that has not learned the wind believes itself immortal," Caitlin said quietly, and she saw then the point at which he would take hurt. She could not call him back. This is the science of mothers, knowing the moment you become only the weather your son moves through. He left her when the duty he owed to the men whose blood would be given the next day called him by name. She stood with the letter until the river's air made her fingers ache, and then put it at last into the brazier that had been set for warmth. The scrap curled black. Smoke rose. It smelled very faintly of bread. When Bran went again to the Godswood, the voice in the space between trunks was not waiting for him. He did not know whether to be glad. He touched the bark with the tentative respect of someone thanking a stranger for a favor that had not been asked and that could not be returned. The weirwood leaned in that tiny bit it always did under snowfall and then did not move at all. He waited. He had learned that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. Sometimes waiting was the cleverest thing. Summer ranged the edges and returned. In the distance, someone in the yard cried out an oath, and sound spun a flock of crows up off the stables that had been picking at frozen manure with more patience than taste. Bran listened to their calls fall back into the air and wished them quiet. They obliged. They were not his birds. They were only birds. He smiled to himself at the small delight of a wish fulfilled when no wish had been set upon the world. When at last his hand numbed to the forearm from cold, he pulled it away and shook warmth back into his fingers. "We did it," he said to Summer, which was the first time he had not been entirely sure of who he was using that "we" to mean. Summer put his head into Bran's chest and shoved, hard and affectionate, and Bran wobbled with the sudden contact and laughed out loud, the sound free of anything that might be mistaken for composure. In a chamber in the Red Keep where the floor tiles had been laid by a man who loved patterns and the window gave a view of the city like a scab you could not help picking, a woman with bright hair sat with a girl who did not weep. Sansa held her back very straight. She folded her hands upon her knee to keep them still. She had not imagined that doing as she had been taught could hurt so much. The woman watching her had done as she had been taught all her life and hurt others, which was not a comfort. "You will learn," the queen said to her as if they were two women at a stitching frame and the elder was smoothing the younger girl's mistakes. "People will ask for your tears as if they are pearls. You will discover that you have only so many to give. Sansa glanced up. "My father," she said, and the word had weight but also had been taught to say less than it meant. "May I take a gown of mourning for him?" "Of course," the queen said. "All the city mourns." She smiled. It was a private joke that there should be so much mourning and so little grief. She was wrong. The city grieves in ways queens do not hear. Over cheap wine in low rooms, where the floor is never quite clean, men had already begun to tell the story of how unruly birds had put their bodies between a blade and a man they did not know. The story would change with every cup. It would become whatever the man telling it needed it to be. This is what stories do. Queens sometimes forget this, because their stories do not change until they are dead. Down the long road, Yoren kept them to the ditches when daylight came. Parties of soldiers rode by with the entitled clatter of men whose purpose excuses their horses' sweat. Twice, men in Lannister red passed so close that Arya could see the scuffs on their stirrup irons. She made herself small enough to vanish under the lip of the cart. She made herself smaller than fear. Ned walked without looking at them. He kept his eyes on the ruts. He counted the tooth marks of wagon wheels as if the arithmetic could lead him somewhere else entirely. At night, when it was safe to do so, he found a moment with the boy who was not a boy, and when he said her name, he said it as if he were borrowing it and would bring it back without scratch. "I know," she whispered. Her eyes glinted. Children have odd reserves of calm that they spend very badly at odd times. She spent some of hers now in not throwing her arms around him where 100 eyes could see. "Where is Sansa?" "Here," he said, and the word meant not here in space but here in the net he had been permitted to not. "She will be safe as any of us are permitted to be safe. Safe as Aerys' mistress," Arya muttered, and he was startled by the way cruel history had crept into her talk as easily as a cat through a half-shut door. He did not chide her. He did not have the energy, and also he found he did not want this bite in her to be scoured away by gentler words. She would need it. "You must do everything Yoren says," he told her. He had to make a father's shape with a few pieces and fewer tools. "You must keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, which will be hard for you because my daughter has a sword where other girls have a tongue." "I have a sword where other girls have a needle," she said, and her mouth twitched because she had made a joke that felt like a task well cut. "I named it." "Good." He did not say, "Do not name the things you're going to lose." He thought it and swallowed it and let it make him bitter inside where it could not be helped. He folded her into him under a hedge while the others pretended not to see. The smell of her hair, soap and road and sleep, was the first thing that had felt like truth since morning. He released her before the truth could become a demand. He felt the eyes of the world on his back and let them sit there as if they were birds come to perch without his permission. Bran began to test the fence that had been put up in his world by the men who loved him the best. He did it gently. He did not wish to hurt. He learned which words closed Luwin's face as a man closes a book he is done with, and which ones opened it. He learned to take the wolf's thoughts into himself when there was no one to see him do it. He learned to smooth his hand along the curve where bark met root as if he were learning the waist of a dance partner. He learned that there were places in the castle where the stones spoke more loudly than others, where the air on his skin felt like the edge of a note waiting to be played. He learned he was watched by more than family. Birds tracked him with the terrible, equal attention they give to everything that might be food. A certain old woman in the kitchens made the sign with her fingers that the oldest women make when the old gods are named. A boy who mucked the stables looked at Bran with an odd fever in his eyes, as if the world were about to break into two and he had placed all his small coin on one side. On a night when wind blew out of the north and wrung the trees as if to make them speak, he woke with a taste of iron in his mouth and the memory of a voice saying, "We will have something when tea is time," and he whispered into the bed straw, "Take from me, then, if it must be, but do not take from them." And he meant a list so long he could not have spoken it even if he had had the breath of 10 men. Somewhere to the south, a man slept in a ditch with his head close enough to another man's head that their breaths arranged themselves without trying into a single pattern. That small economy of air made them comrades in a way oaths cannot purchase. The man who had been a lord dreamed he was pushing his hand into cold water to pull up a stone, and when he woke, His palm ached as if he had done it. He flexed his fingers and felt the little iron disc bite into his skin. In the Red Keep, Peter Baelish sat in a room with no witnesses and spoke aloud to himself in a voice so thin that it would have made a liar of anyone who tried to repeat it. "Birds," he said, tasting the word. "Birds and boys." He arranged a stack of ledgers and thought about how the riverlands would burn and how much wheat would become soot and how men's faith kept them from understanding arithmetic. He considered sending a certain letter and did not. He considered sending a different one and did. Said only, "A flock can be scattered by throwing one stone at the right time." He had spent an hour that afternoon finding the right stone and the right hand to throw it, and then had sat with his eyes closed and imagined how it would look when it struck. In that same keep, the Queen moved her checker-piece soldiers on a board designed to look like the city. She moved them not to parameters of rules but to the choreography of insult. She had been raised to dance like this. When one of her ladies hesitated on a particular square, she slapped the woman's hand lightly and then apologized as if it had been a love tap. The lady smiled because the smile was required and then went home and broke a cup on a hearth. The ravens roost that night in places men had not bothered to knock them from. They dreamed raven dreams, simple and near. In their dreams were eyes and eggs and the sudden up of air under a wing. One or two carried with them a flavor that was not bird color, a memory of a hand pressed to cold bark and of a word that had not been spoken in any language they knew. In the way of birds, they made nothing of it in waking, and yet it altered the angle of their flight in small ways no man could have measured. Bran woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of two men arguing about boots. He listened as if he were a spy and then laughed at himself for treating ordinary life as if it were an encoded message. Hodder brought him clothes without being asked. Hodder's kindness had widened in the weeks since the fall to fill many of the spaces kindness had vacated. There were still spaces it could not reach. That was not Hodder's fault. Bran wrapped patience around those spaces like a bandage. He had not thought himself a sorcerer, and even now when the gods would let him in and the birds did not resist his hand on their focus, he rebelled at the idea that he had joined the company of things that gathered in old Nan's tales. He tested himself with small cheats. He asked Summer to turn when he did not need him to. The wolf turned and came and sat with elaborate dignity, accepting the reward of Bran's palm on his head as if the boy were a lord offering a tilt of his hand to a favored knight. He sent his thought out along a branch and into a crow that had decided to caw at a time. He wanted quiet and made the bird wonder about a patch of thawing dung on the other side of the yard. When the bird went there and settled to the comfort of routine, Bran thought, "I am only practicing. The old things of the world do not like to be used for small purposes." He thought this and did it anyway and then felt shamed by the warm ease of success. At the forge, Mikken cursed a nail into admitting what shape it should take. Mikken's curses had an artistry that gave them value beyond the moment. Bran listened and took note and did not repeat them. Some things belong to men who have earned them. He knew this because men had told him he had not earned his wolf, and that had made him angry, and then ashamed of being angry because this was a child's confusion repeated daily. Why must I have the thing I did not ask for when some other boy who wants it cannot have it no matter how polite he is? He did not ask to fall. He did not ask to rise like this. On the second morning after the bell, he woke with a nosebleed that had dried in his sleep and left a rusty smudge on the linen. He rubbed at the stain and discovered how deeply it had gone. It had an outline like a little map, and if he had been the sort of child who gave himself over to imagining countries in toast and clouds, he might have traced borders with a fingertip and invented a river. Instead, he changed the linen and told no one. In the south, where some trees hold green long past their time out of sheer stubbornness, the wagons had turned onto the King's Road. The smell of the sea was loosening its hold on the air. Arya had stopped pretending she did not wish to touch the sword she had named. She touched it carefully when no one watched. The blade whispered to her fingers. It had not been made by a man who loved her. It had been given to her by a man whose love for swords made him generous to any hand that could wield one. She took it out in the intervals when Yoren pissed. She slept with it by her thigh. Ned saw this once and looked away not because he disapproved, but because approval hurt more. They passed a village where a boy stood with a wooden sword and a woman cried his name from a doorway, and the boy did not go because the name did not feel like his any longer. They passed a place in the fields where men had lain with their wounds turned to the sky and made a feast of flies. Yoren did not stop. He never stopped by things that could not be helped. He had learned this lesson at 14 and had spent the rest of his life polishing it to a dull sheen. People spoke of the hand's death in tones intended to test the direction of wind. Some grieved because it is terrifying to live in a world where no one is grieving. Some spoke well of the boy king because it is terrifying to live in a world where no one is safe from a boy's whims. Some glanced at the dark caravan and saw in it the same old promise. All roads lead to absolution if you are willing to give up enough of yourself to buy it. No one recognized the man who walked one step behind Yoren and had once knelt in a hot square and felt the shadow of a blade pass where his neck would have been. On a rainy noon where the road stepped down toward a stream, Yoren halted without turning. "We make the hedge," he said, and as if he had indicated a tavern by name, the men turned their faces and feet to the ragged little shelter and made themselves fit under it as well as was possible. They passed a flask in a way that suggested they had known one another longer than they had. Ned leaned against a trunk. Water drew a line down from his temple along his cheekbone. Across from him, a boy being a boy and not a girl stared at him with the uncompromising frankness only children are allowed to carry without being punished. "I know your eyes," the child said. Ned lifted his chin the smallest degree, as if his face belonged to another man and he were trying it on for fit. "A man has many faces if he has lived long enough," he answered. The boy shook his head. "No," he said, and his certainty was an odd little bird perched on a twig of voice. "You look like the man on the steps. I saw his hair and his face the same." He wrinkled his nose. "Not the same hair now. Don't be a fool," one of the men muttered. "Their hair was brown and this man's hair is brown. That's the end of it. Brown hair is not a breed." The boy subsided. Yoren's eyes slid to Ned's and then away. Rain deepened. The hedge dripped in ways that felt like intent. Ned found that his heart had started to run again. He put his hand to his chest and pressed as if to remind it how. In Winterfell, Bran sat with a book and did not read it. He watched the dust motes move in a beam of light and tried to name them. Bird dust, bark dust, boy dust. He found none of the names satisfying. He wanted to ask the old voice between the trees to tell him whether things make different dust depending on what they are. He wanted to tell Luwin that the question mattered. He wanted to ask his mother if she had ever felt herself being watched by something that did not mean her harm but would not save her either. He wanted everything to line up like tracks in fresh snow. Clear, inevitable, leading somewhere you could point to. Tucked in his bed that night, he felt summer hover at the edge of him as a shadow will hover at the edge of your sight when you are certain someone stands behind you in a door. He let the wolf in and they went running along a fence in a place that was not at Winterfell. He saw a man's back with the calm of an animal that knows backs can be leapt upon if needed. He smelled fear like a spice someone had spilled in a pot and tried to stir away. He smelled his own boy's smell somewhere in the mix of road and horse and iron. He did not understand this. He chased it with the patience of a predator who understands there will be a time when patience is no longer required. In the castle, far above the kitchen and the place where stores were kept in strict order and the place where women gathered to plait hair, in the rookery with its smell of guano and stone, a single raven turned its head 3 times and then lay it along its wing and slept. In its sleep it spoke a word, and the word was not a sound. It was a shape made in air by the absence of sound. If Maester Luwin had heard it, he would have tried to write it with a quill and would have ruined the page. The raven slept on, content. Its dream was of a boy with his hand to a white tree, and of bells, and of a square full of summer birds that had forgotten it was too hot to fly. By the 5th day on the road, the line of men and boys had taken on the rhythm that long marches enforce. Some had found friends. Some had found enemies. Both kinds of finding make the miles shorter in their way. Arya had learned where she could piss without being remarked upon. She had learned to eat without using her hands to signal the old house manners that made servants love and hate you. She had learned that grief eats when it can and then sleeps like a sated animal and then wakes hungry again. She did not think in these sentences, but the lessons laid themselves down in her with the weight of things that would bring themselves to her later when she had need of them. Ned found himself speaking to a boy who had stolen a loaf of bread and a knife and got caught with the bread because the knife had made him bold enough to stop being cautious and so had been the thing that had undone him. "Do you regret the knife?" Ned asked, curious to see if the boy had understood the real shape of his story. "I regret not taking two," the boy said frankly. "Then when they came I would have stabbed both men." "And where would that have left you?" Ned asked mildly. "With no bread but two knives, which is worth less than one piece of bread." "At least you can sell a knife," the boy said. "Bread is always already gone." Ned could not argue with the harsh logic of a hungry child. The world had fed him abundance long enough that he had to remind himself to be grateful for it. He looked at the boy and felt both pity and a small, unflattering pleasure at hearing a clean thought cut. "The bread," he said, "makes you live the night. The knife makes you live the day differently. Both matter." The boy squinted at him. "You talk like a sept man." "Some men have accused me of worse," Ned said dryly, and turned away to hide the expression that wanted to sit on his face. One evening, as shadows lifted up from the ground and took their old places on the walls, the line of returning ravens homed toward Winterfell and then kinked in the air and flew out over the godswood instead, as if a small hand had reached up and twisted a string. Bran sat with his back against the heart tree and watched their splayed-toed landings. The way they made the world's ugliness look efficient and somehow elegant. He reached out without reaching and felt them like smooth stones underwater. He thought, "We will need you again," and then caught himself because he had slid too quickly into making them his hands. They lifted their wings and resettled and sent an agreed sound through the air as if in answer. He dozed like that, hand on bark, wolf at heel, birds overhead. The godswood felt not kind but steady. Sometimes steadiness is kindness. When he woke, the stars were busy at their work and the snow's thin crust had glittered into a different set of rules. He shivered and Hodder lifted him with a crook of his arm. Hodder's breath made white smoke. Hodder said, "Hodder," with a dignity that suggested he meant something more. Sleep took Bran in the close-walled dark and carried him not to the road, not to the city, but to a place of water that moved under ice. It moved without sound, because sound lifts away from ice like a bird from water, shaking droplets. The movement had a destination. All moving water has a destination. He thought of the voice in the trees that had told him a price would be taken, and he thought of debts he had watched his father pay in the language of honor, and he wondered if there were a way to pay such a thing in installments. He woke with a word on his lips that would not be written in any of Luwin's books. He swallowed it before it could become air. Some words should be kept warm in the stomach like medicine you do not take until the fever is high. He lay quietly and let morning find him before he found morning. In the capital, men came to the queen with requests that had nothing to do with ravens or old gods. Bread, the dole. Men refused to let their daughters go up to the castles to carry clean linen. They muttered in markets, and their muttering had begun to find itself organized, which is never a good sign. She leaned back and ordered more soldiers to stand at the gates of squares where trouble liked to breed. This would not help. It would help. Both were true. She considered summoning her brother, and then reminded herself that he was a sword you could not sheath once you had drawn him. The bruise on her heart where birds had struck it still colored her mood. She called for Ser Island and had him stand before her until her eyes grew tired of looking at him. The blank steadiness of his face dulled the edge of her anger and made her think that the world could be brought again to the point where things were restored to their proper places. Peter Baelish went to see a certain poor man and gave him a ring. He made sure there were witnesses to whom the ring's print would serve more than the ring itself. He went to see a certain rich man and took from him a trinket in exchange for information that had been expensive to acquire and cheap to give. He tried to think of what had happened on the steps as a problem with a solution. He suspected, very quietly and in the privacy of his most private thought, that some problems arrange themselves beyond solution, the way pieces sometimes refuse to fit unless you are willing to take a hammer to the board. He did not like this thought. He told himself a story in which his cleverness, not the gods, would have the last word. The story made him smile. He arranged a dinner. He arranged another. Arrangements multiplied like the kittens of a cat you had thought was male. And in the slow places in the far north, where your breath can freeze your lashes together and make the world a white blur you must navigate with your other senses, an old weight shifted. It did not wake. It had never slept entirely. When old things stir, men make decisions, or else decisions make men. The stirring was not for now. It was a promise made in a language that had not yet been invented. Bran did not sense that. He sensed only his own weariness when he came back from a dream too long, and the rush of joy when Summer laid his heavy head across Bran's lap and sighed the sigh of a creature that knows it is next to the thing it belongs beside. On the King's Road, between one copse and the next, a rider in muddy color approached the slow-moving dark line and reined in with a lift of his hand. Yoren brought them to a halt because he always wanted to be the one to choose when they stopped. The rider glanced along the string of boys and men and then let his eyes land on Ned and did not move them. His face did a little calculation. He turned his horse without speaking and rode away. Yoren watched him go. After a long moment he said, "We leave the road," and did not explain. He did not need to. Men who had lived too long to need explanation fell into the ditch and made their way along its tight green corridor with the efficiency of infantry. Night caught them there with foxes hunting at the edge of hearing. They slept and did not. Ned let his head fall back and stared up through a lattice of twigs at a slice of sky that had learned to do without color. He thought of the black wall that waited to take him in and make him nameless, and he tried to imagine how he would speak to it when he reached it. His mouth did not yet know the words, but his breathing had already begun to adapt to the rhythm of a life lived in sight of one thing that does not move. In Winterfell, Bran dreamed of that wall and woke with tears on his face that had frozen on his skin. He did not brush them away. They burned where they thawed. He went to the window and looked out at the Godswood and thought of the silence under its snow. He began to understand that the quiet he had loved. Ed was stuffed with many kinds of voices, and that some of them had learned to mimic the quiet to be heard in the only way given to them. He placed his palm on the cold stone of the sill and said, with childish courtesy that he refused to shame himself for, "Thank you." The stone said nothing. It held the night upright. That was answer enough. And somewhere, far away, in a bed that had been made for comfort and had once been shared by two who had enjoyed the story of one another's bodies enough to pretend it could be made to endure longer than the act itself, a girl who had held still all day to keep her life from breaking lay with her eyes open and stared at a canopy where silk had been stitched into flowers and thought that flowers were not true, and made a promise to herself that when someone at last unfastened this old cage she would not step out gently. She would run. She would not look back. She would not know in which direction she was running until her feet found a road. But that was all right. Roads are old and love all feet, even those which have forgotten how to belong to themselves. So the day that had begun with bells ended in silence in many places and in small, ordinary noises in all the others. A spoon against a pot. A man's low laugh as he lay too tired to sleep and made himself sleep with memory. Boys coughing into their blankets. A wolf turning 3 times before collapsing with indecent grace. A boy who had put his hand to a tree's cold skin, feeling his heart beat in time with sap and with steps on the road, and with an old thing that had promised to come for dew when the dew was due. Winterfell listened. The snow fell without comment. In the square in the south, the last stubborn crow pecked one more time at a spot that interested it and then tipped its head, pleased. Above it, where men had built a place for gods to be impressed by what men build, a bell hung like a held breath. When it moved, it would move because someone had decided it should, or because something else had. For the moment, it did not move at all, in the way that sometimes the world does indeed hold still for a boy who has asked it to. Mist came up off the river like breath from a tired horse, and the reeds along the waterline took on the grayness of it so completely that they seemed built out of weather. Yoren led his string of the unwanted along the low ridge until the light went the cold color that means a day has stopped arguing with itself. Behind him trudged men who had agreed to be invisible and a few who did not yet know how to be. In the damp, the smell of wet leather and wool joined the iron penny's taste of the river. Arya found each print her feet made as if it were a personal answer to the question of whether she existed. Ned walked as if he had been born without hips, as if his stride were only knees and will and the memory of how a man looks when he goes forward, because forward is the only gift left to him. They had left the road because the road draws eyes. They used a sheep path that knew only the stories of sheep and the men who killed them. The path stitched itself along the riverbank and then squared its shoulders and went up into a copse where the ground took on the argument of roots. "Hold," Yoren said without urgency, and the line came to rest like a snake that has found a warm stone. He turned his head and squinted toward the lowest point where the path lowered like a curtsy into the water. 2 riders had come down the far ridge with the thoughtless green speed of men who had eaten a good meal and expected the world to note it. "They have colors," muttered one of the older men under his breath, the sound shaped as if to make a use of his weariness. The men had colors. Yes. A red that had learned how to talk and a gold that had stopped speaking altogether. Men in those colors had a way of making oaths happen to other people. Yoren let his shoulders sag a fraction as if in resignation and then frowned, which was as much courtesy as he would ever extend to a problem. "Back in the bush," he said, and his hand moved light to indicate how a boy becomes a fern. The riders splashed through the shallows and brought their horses up with a clatter of stones. They were not the sort who feared an arrow from a reed bed. They were young enough to not believe they could bleed. The one in front had a nose that had broken badly and decided to stay broken as a way of announcing its independence. "Who goes?" the broken-nosed one called, and his voice had the round tone of King's Landing, where men learn to throw sound at walls as if they are women carrying baskets. "Black brothers," Yoren said. He rested both hands on his staff as if it were a friend who might not be good at listening but could be trusted to stand upright. The second rider's mouth twisted. "Those are boys," he said, with an ugly amusement that could have come only from a life spent examining other people's mistakes. "And that one's hardly got hair where a man needs hair." His horse sidled. He jerked the reins rudely and the animal stamped in protest. "Brothers to be," Yoren said. "Every black feather starts in a nest. You wanting to count them in case you lose track on your fingers later." The broken nose snorted at the joke and looked beyond Yoren in the lazy way of men confident they will be obeyed even by geography. If his gaze slipped over Ned, it did not arrest. Ned turned his head just enough to show his profile only to a hawk. He had learned the art of withdrawing himself from a glance since morning and did not yet know what it had cost him. "We're to stop such trains," the second rider said softer, as if this confidence were a thing he liked to put his tongue to when it was just him and his friend. "Orders." "Then obey them," Yoren said. "Stop us. We'll camp here for a month. Take our piss down to the river and pour it in golden cups." He tapped his staff on the dirt. "We go to put these boys behind a wall of ice where they'll mind no king but their own hardships. Make your tally. Find us later if you wish to see whether hunger and snow shape common thieves into uncommon men. But now, unless you mean to take the black yourself on account of how your boots already look it, let us go." The broken nose laughed. The other did not. He looked again, and this time his gaze passed in a way that suggested he had left something behind without knowing it. Ned felt it like a hand raised near his cheek, not yet touching. Arya, pressed against a hawthorn, held her breath until it hurt. Only when the hurt itself began to make sound did she let it out in a slow leak through her mouth. A black disc on a leather thong gleamed briefly at Yoren's throat as he shifted the staff. The second rider saw it and frowned without exactly knowing why. There are small heraldries known to men who do not frequent halls. The Night's Watch token meant this caravan had worse friends than him. "Go on," Broken Nose said at last, with the magnanimity of a man freeing a thing he could not grasp in his hand anyway. "We would have," Yoren said, too quietly for offense and too audibly for any man to think of taking offense. They passed. The hooves made churned cream of the river shallows. When they were gone, the reed bed exhaled, and the boys who had been plants became boys again, creaking with relieved stiffness. "They'll talk," Ned said low. The words grazed the inside of his teeth as if their underside had been sharpened. "They always do," Yoren replied. He shifted his staff to the other hand. And still the wall gets its share. You think the world wants to keep its boys? It does not. It can lose 100 and call it weather. Arya stole a glance at her father's face. The hair that was not there made him look as if secrets had been peeled from him. He had grown more edges in a short time. She wanted to say something bright and true. That she had kept her water skin from splitting. That she had found the print of a weasel in the mud. That if she closed her eyes while she ran, she could feel the ground differently. But she kept her mouth the way he had told her. She stored the bright things for the hour when their light would not be mistaken for carelessness. At Winterfell, Osha rolled the same 3 pebbles in her palm until the skin learned their language. She spat in the ash and watched the spit make dark freckles. The cell they kept her in had been built according to a plan and had responded with resentment. The stone wanted to be out under weather. Men keep stones in boxes and call it prudence. Osha understood the difference between a stone's consent and its use. The old gods listened to both. "Do you know why the ravens flew?" the boy asked her. The boy with the wolf smell clinging to him like smoke. Bran had come because the quiet of his mother's grief filled the high places of the castle, and because his wolf was drawn to the smell of this woman as if she were a path. Hodder had frowned at the door and then contented himself to stand outside where his size would show caution to any man with too many ideas. Osha smoothed the pebbles with a thumb that had a scar across it in the shape of a crescent moon. "Ravens fly because that's what they do. They came when I asked," Bran said. He had not meant to say it, but the words had waited behind his teeth and were tired of waiting. Osha's eyes, pale as if they had been washed too many times in cold water, flicked to his face and then down to his hands and then to the stone she sat on. "You asked with the right mouth," she allowed. "Some mouths speak and the world hears only wind. Some mouths speak and the trees turn their faces. What will they ask in return?" Bran said, because he was learning to hear the part of any conversation that is not a conversation. "Ask," Osha repeated softly, her mouth making a small shape around the S. "You already gave. That's how it works. You don't know it's gone until you find yourself reaching for it and there's nothing in the bowl." Her gaze lifted again. "You gave the quiet a stir. The quiet likes to be left to its wool and spinning. But sometimes it don't mind being bothered if you're small and you come respectful. It remembers small." "What if I go big?" Bran asked, not entirely joking. "Then the quiet will go bigger," Osha said simply. "And you'll wish for small again." Bran put his fingers to the stone wall as if to listen with his hands. The ripples where the mason had left the imprint of his trowel were a kind of language, even if he did not know whether to read or speak. "I want to do it again," he confessed, and heard the ugliness in it. He did not think he wanted power. He wanted his father to keep walking on the road he had been permitted. He wanted the square in the city to remember the day something besides men had held sway. He wanted to know that if the world troubled him with bells again, he would be able to answer. "You will," Osha said. "That's what frightens men who carry swords. The things not knowing when boys will become bigger than they are." She leaned forward. "But if you do it again, do it like you did it the first time. Don't go at it with your pride." She bared cruel teeth in a smile that was no one's comfort. "The old ones don't like pride unless it's theirs. Maester Luwin says. Maester Luwin says a tale is only as good as the man who writes it down." Osha cut in, amused. "Aye, he's right. He writes fine tales that are true where you want them to be. But there are truths that don't fit on his lines. That's not his sin. That's a matter of his tools." She held up the pebbles. "A woman can't skin a deer with a spoon, neither." Hodder's shadow shifted at the door. Bran heard the familiar rhythm of his breath and took comfort from it as a small boy might take comfort from the weight of a blanket. "They said a price," he murmured. "Aye," Osha said. "They always say a price. Sometime. Yes, they take it in coin you didn't know you had." She tilted her head. "You've been bleeding at the nose." Bran touched the place and found the dried flake of it. Surprised, as if Osha had pulled a coin from behind his ear. "Only a little. That's how it starts," the woman said. "Only a little. Then you find yourself counting what little buys." She leaned back and let the stone carry her. But don't be afraid of it. Fear's a poor purse. You put everything in it and get nothing out that's worth the keeping. At Riverrun, the Tully Hall sat under a pall of busy grief. Death in a castle sets servants moving faster, not slower. They scrub more, mend more, make more bread, carry more buckets, as if weight and work will persuade the world to change its mind. Caitlin moved through it like a woman who had slept badly and decided to be courteous to the day about it. Her father had taken to his bed with the manner of a man who had used up all his standing. He drifted in and out of speech, remembering a child's laughter that had happened in another century and the pattern of trout in a stream that had since been fouled by men who did not love it. When he knew her with a sudden brightness that hurt to stand in. "They'll make you hard," he told her once from the pillow, fierce as a dying man can be in the small hour before dawn. "Don't let them strike you. But when the blow is done, don't carry the shape of it around under your skin." "Yes, father," she said, as if she were 6 and had broken a plate. Robb's counsel in the great hall made noise the walls had heard before in other wars. Men love the theater of maps. They point and drag and lay their palms flat to feel the power of deciding where an army will walk. The great John bellowed and laughed and bellowed again, and in the pauses between it a slighter man, Galbart Glover, said precise things in a precise voice that slipped through the Grecians roaring like a thin, sharp knife through boiled leather. Caitlin watched and felt both pride and a particular terror that belongs to mothers who have discovered their boys have become men with other men's opinions and cannot be gathered again into the circle of a single woman's sense. "Lord Fry will require flattery," someone said. "Lord Fry will require coin," the Blackfish said flatly, which was truer. "Lord Fry will require a pound of himself," Caitlin added, and all the men looked at her and then glanced down in the universal male acknowledgement that a woman had said a thing they had not dared to. "He will wish to be consulted at length before the consultation. He will wish to enumerate his grievances and then be praised for having borne them. Take patience into the twins as if it is a delicacy you mean to serve, and do not leave until it is finished." "Will he require a promise?" Robb asked, and the way he kept his voice even in front of these men made her love him anew and dread his innocence anew in equal measure. "He will require what he can get," Caitlin said, "which is what all men require, and men too easily forget it when it is themselves they are talking about." The Blackfish's mouth twitched in a way that would have been a smile if he had been a different man. "Walders have long memories and short courtesies," he said. "We'll put a bridle on him made of his own vanity." "If we can," Robb said. He stood long by the table after the others had taken themselves away to their wine and their stories of how wars had gone when they were younger and king's blood ran in sheets in their accounts. "Mother," he said, and that one word, paired of everything else, made him a boy again for an instant. "Will you go? If I do not, you will go and talk of swords when you should be speaking of small grievances with a man whose joy is narrower and more intricate than yours. Let me do this part." She laid her hand over his. The bones seemed too big for the skin because that is how boys become men, with their bones deciding first. "Promise me you will not let your anger decide what your wolves will do." He glanced aside at Grey Wind, who lay with his paws crossed and eyes shut. The picture of peace if you did not notice how often he opened one eye under his lid to see how the men around him breathed. "I have no anger," Robb said, a foolish young man's claim. "Only duty." Caitlin squeezed his hand. "Duty is anger obliged to wear a coat and shoes." In King's Landing, Sansa slept badly under silk. Night had taught her that it could go on without her permission. She had learned to move like a piece on a board she did not understand, and it excited her sometimes in a way that frightened her because it made the danger gleam. She said the right things to the right people in the right rooms at the right times. She learned how to sadden and how to brighten. She learned to walk beside the queen so precisely that her footsteps matched the older woman's without either of them thinking of it. One night, the hound found her standing by a window with her face so set that he might have mistaken her for cut marble. "You make a pretty statue," he said in his ruined voice. "Shall I fetch pigeons to shit on your head so the resemblance is complete?" She did not flinch. The first week she had flinched for every roughness. She had made herself a promise to spend her flinches better. "You were there," she said softly, "on the day when the birds came." He leaned his shoulder to the side of the window and considered it as if he had never stood in it before. "I was," he said. He ran his tongue over his teeth in a gesture that managed to be both vulgar and defensive. "And did you think it a miracle?" The word was a big one, heavy inside her mouth. The way a word is when it has been taught to you with great tenderness at a child's bedside, and you try it again as if it will sound the same in a different room. "I thought it a mess," he said. "Miracle is a word for men who've got time to make their lies tidy." He tilted his head. "But I felt the air go wrong. You know the feeling when you step into a room where someone is waiting to throw a bucket of water and you've just not found where they're hiding yet? It was like that." She nodded, because her body had remembered it too. The prickle over skin, the sense that nature itself had taken sides and not found hers. "Are you sorry?" she asked in a small voice she despised herself for having. "For what?" He bared his teeth. "For you not losing your head? For you losing your father? For me swinging or not swinging? Girl, I'm sorry for the world only in that it keeps making days." She folded her hands until each finger felt the bones of its neighbor and took comfort in the proof. "I mean for being cruel," she said, and regretted the asking at once, because it made everything in the room smaller and too bright. "I was born ugly," he said. "Ugly makes men cruel or kind. I chose cruel because it protects the soft, and I've got soft enough inside me to feed a wolf. Don't look for kindness where men have learned to hate themselves." He pushed off the wall and took a step that made the rushes whisper. "Learn to sing a song that keeps your throat whole," he added. His voice changed, as if he had said the first thing for himself and this other thing for her. "You walk with a queen. Queens eat girls for breakfast." Later that night, Sansa wrote by candle a letter that said what the queen wished her to say. Words can be taught to put their faces on in the morning like women. She put the face on them that would please. Then she made another letter in her head that she did not write. It would have said, "Do not come, or if you must, do not come as my brother but only as a storm, and if you love me, throw your love at a man who deserves it and not at the idea of your sister bound in a city that will use her as a lid on a boiling pot." She did not know how to send such a message unless she cut her own skin and posted it. She slept with her letter under her pillow and dreamed of birds. Bran's world narrowed and widened each day like a bellows. There were hours when all he could do was concentrate on moving from bed to window to chair without making a sound that would summon pity. And there were hours when he put his hand on the weirwood and traveled along a route line to a place where snow had never learned to fall properly. He saw strangers in these places the way a man sees fellows in a fog, shapes that might be a friend if you spoke to them, and might be a tree if you did not. He learned to rest his mind above a street and let it fill as if it were a cup held under a spout. Once, he found himself looking at a table set with bowls in a room where floor had the slope of a ship deck but did not move as a ship moves. A man with long white hair like a winter river flicked his eyes up so quickly that Bran was certain he had been seen. The man said a name, not his name, and the room's small people looked up, their mouths full. Bran fled, like a boy caught looking through a window into a home where family sat down to eat without him. After that, he spent 3 days in places he knew, as if to remind his senses what his own air felt like. On the 4th, Jojen Reed and his sister came to Winterfell on feet that had learned to walk as carefully as if the earth itself were a trap. They arrived without heraldry, as the marsh teaches its children. A Mallister man-at-arms at the gate yawned them past because he had been standing too long and no one had told him to yawn differently for crannogmen. Jojen was slight, with eyes the color of water where it deepens, not blue and not green and not gray. Mira moved like the shadow of a bird over shallow lake, quick and light and careful not to make ripples that would betray her to what lives below. They presented themselves silently to Catelyn, and when her eyes settled on Mira's net, she caught her breath because she remembered a smaller, earlier version of it and a man who had once climbed a tower because love had pushed him there and an arrow had told him an honest story. She made an involuntary motion with her hand as if to push that memory back under the surface, and the girl saw the motion and pretended to have seen nothing. We came because the water told us to go, Jojen said. He was not insolent. He had a marsh courtesy that does not bow where stone does. It did, Mira said in a tone that made it more than a child's agreement. The reeds were in a mood. Ours are in a mood here as well, Caitlin said. The stone reeds of men. They complain and bend and scold. Mira smiled, quick. Our reeds tell stories but don't scold. Though my father says they scold too, in a manner. Howland Reed, Caitlin said, tasting the name and not letting it show that it tasted of old gratitude and newer fear. You are welcome for his sake and your own. Jojen's gaze passed from her face to Bran's and stayed there. The room shifted around its edges. Bran had the sudden wholly unreasonable sensation that he stood at the edge of a pit, and if he leaned the least bit toward the boy he would fall without ache. He felt it as a call. Summer, asleep by the hearth, opened one eye and closed it again as if the room had made a comment that did not require the canine reply. You've been dreaming, Jojen said to Bran. It was not a question. He said it as one boy might tell another that he'd scraped his knee. Everyone dreams, Bran answered carefully. Not like you, Jojen said. He approached until they were the distance of a whisper apart. You found the birds and sent them to a place where men had made a crowd. Caitlyn's hand clenched. Boy, she said, the single word full of a warning and a plea in anger at the presumption of strangers. Jojen tilted his head without looking away from Bran. I mean your son no harm, he said. And no disrespect to you, my lady. I speak what I'm told to speak. The green speaks. Yamu. And I'll why a reed that wind moves. You will tell me everything, Caitlin said, which was the Tully in her. The woman who loved to have a meal laid out where she could see it. You will tell me what moved you, and where it hopes to go next. In time, Jojen said. In time, Mira echoed, but her tone made the words less exasperating. She made them into a promise she would hold him to. You dreamed? Jojen went on to Bran, ignoring another small sound of Caitlyn's patience wearing thin. In your dream you moved the waking world. That is a kind of theft. The world notices when it is stolen from. It will ask you, sometimes with kindness and sometimes hungry, to give something back. A price, Bran said. A pattern, Jojen corrected. Price suggests coin, and coin offends rivers. They like to be paid in changes, not in pieces. What have you lost? Bran thought of the nosebleeds and the way the kitchen looked brighter sometimes until it made his head hurt, and the way he wanted to close his eyes and sleep and sleep and sleep until he woke to a day that did not expect him to fill it with anything that mattered. He thought of how, when he put his hand against bark, the skin felt thinner afterward as if it had been rubbed raw. He did not say all this. It would be a confession, and he had not yet decided if the boy in front of him had any claim on his confessions. Nothing that I cannot spare, he said. Then the river will return tomorrow to ask if you can spare more, Jojen said simply. Mira came forward then, practical as a woman with a knife and meat is practical. We brought gifts, she said. Oils for the leather of your chairs. A skin cured with a method my father swears by. Fishhooks made by a man who can tie knots in rain. She took a small pouch from her belt and poured out a handful of barbed iron that lay like a coping of teeth in her palm. We are poor in stone and rich in what eats stone. Your men can take what is useful and put us to work to pay for our beds. We do not lie still when we can lie straight. Caitlyn's mouth softened despite herself. You are welcome, she repeated. She looked at her boy and then at the Cranach boy and then at the wolf and thought, if there is a story here, it will unfold with or without my blessing. Then the Tully in her asserted herself and said aloud, You will forgive me if I listen at the door while stories are being told at my hearth. Always, Mira said, grinning. They were given a small room near the kitchens, close enough to hear the buckets go and the women sing, far enough to give them privacy to arrange their reeds. That night, when the castle's breath grew slow, Jojen climbed barefoot to the godswood and stood at the edge of the pool and looked at his reflection as if it could be coaxed into telling him a thing he had not yet said to himself. Bran sat where he always sat and put his hand where he always put it. They did not speak for a time that was not exactly waiting. The heart tree watched them with the without eye its kind are blessed with. Mira came at length and sat cross-legged on the snow with the elegance of a child who has taught herself to be comfortable on any seat. "You'll go north," Jojen said, the words not so much spoken as allowed to exist between them, "whether you mean to or not." "I cannot go," Bran said reflexively, with the indignation of a boy told fields are off-limits. "I'm needed here, and," he added with the honesty that made him loved by people less honest than they wished they were, "I cannot walk it. Hodder cannot stand forever. No man can." "You will go on feet that never tire," Jojen said. "You will go on feet that do not belong to you." "Hodders." Bran tried to make it a joke. "It was not." "Wolves," Mira said lightly, as if she were naming a soup for supper. "Deer. Trees. Some feet are not feet at all." "Trees do not walk," Bran said, half because it was an assertion he had heard all his life and half because it had the exasperation in it that men used to keep old ideas in place. "They don't," Jojen agreed. "Not as we know walking. They have a way of going everywhere at once without moving at all. They will carry you if you let them. And if you make yourself too heavy, they'll set you down someplace you never meant to be, and you'll have to learn to be a boy in that place. Which is the work, I think." "What do they want?" Bran asked quietly. The bark under his palm felt like a skin with an old wound under it. Not healed and not hurting, only present as a note in a chord. "They want what everything old wants," Jojen said. "To be allowed to go on being old, and to not be made foolish by what is newer and faster and hotter. They want time. They want you not to spend it unwisely. They want the price paid because they remember the last time it was not, and how a winter took men like a wife takes a husband the day after the wedding and then keeps taking him in ways that break his back." "Must everything be paid?" Bran pressed, because for a moment he wanted to be a child again and be told there was a story where the hero simply won and ate and slept and woke the next day to find winning had been enough. "No," Mira said. "Some things are gifts, but a gift can make a pig of a man faster than a price can." She tossed a pebble into the pool. The rings went out slow. "We have brought nets," she added cheerfully. "Trees do not like nets, but they will let us use them if we say we do it to feed the people who tend their trunks." Bran almost smiled. He liked the shape of her talk. It had the good sense of a knife you sharpen every day until it seems as if it were born sharp. When they left the Godswood, lights were making ordinary squares in ordinary shutters. Hodder met them with a sound that acknowledged the winter and them and the fact that the door was too small. Mira ducked under his arm as if she had always known the measure of him. Jojen paused and brushed a finger along the grain of teach. Idor and then followed. The heart tree's face watched the empty space where they had been until snow filled it again with its own form of attendance. South of the neck, the King's Road found new problems to put in front of Yoren. A rider in a tarnished cloak approached with a leaf on his sleeve that meant he was a man who belonged in no one's hall. "Gold cloak's 2 days behind you," he said, and pointed with his chin. "Counting very well for men who've never had to." "Let them count," Yoren said. "Counting doesn't build bridges. They'll find what I want them to find. They'll find a boy with a smith's shoulders and a girl with a king's bones," the rider said. His mouth showed too many teeth. "And they'll bring back the girl because that's what makes a boy look like a king. They'll find their own foolishness," Yoren said, unmoved. The rider spurred away, pleased with himself for having delivered a threat with a bow tied to it. Yoren watched him go and then turned his attention to the line. "We break," he said, "in 3 places." The boys blinked at him. They had learned, in the way of people who live in streams of orders, to expect a single flow, one hand directing feet. He split them as if he were a fisherman throwing a net. "You go with Cutjack and take the middle path to the old quarry," he told one. "You, to another, with stones, along the hedgerow until the ground remembers it was once a trench and you keep to that remembering." He turned to Ned and Arya last. "You come with me." "Father," Arya said before she remembered, and Yoren's eyebrow moved the smallest degree in the way of a man appreciating a well-cut piece of wood. "Boy," he said neutrally. They left the road entirely and moved along a cattle track that had been used recently enough to be visible and unloved enough to be safe. grass raised damp fingers to lick at their boots. Twice they stood with the breath shut in their throats while men in Lannister red went past close enough that Arya could see the place where one man's ear had been torn and the other ear had been made too large by the tear's absence. The men rode with their bodies loose and their eyes restless and the resignation of men paid to make boredom expensive. At dusk, Yoren found a shepherd's coat and took it as if he were the sheep coming home to it. The place smelled of lanolin and old piss. It had a roof that had learned the trick of being only as waterproof as necessary. He doled out bread and did not pretend it would be enough. "We walk early," he said. "How early is early?" Arya asked, the question pushed ahead of her by a girl who had learned that information is a weapon and sometimes the only one you are allowed to carry. "Before men have made up their minds what lies they will tell themselves today," Yoren answered. "We've a better chance of passing if their heads are still empty." "Doesn't seem like the kind to fill quick," Arya muttered, which cheered Yoren in a fashion he would deny if accused. Ned lay with his head on his rolled cloak and counted the hole in the roof where he would see a star if this were the sort of place stars let themselves be seen. He thought of Sansa, and the way she had learned to arrange her face, and the way she had loved songs. He thought of the Hound, and the way the man had stood and told the truth because men had left him little else to tell. He thought of Robb and the men who loved to tell him what war was. He thought of his wife and of a river. He thought of a bell and of birds. He turned his face into the wool. When they moved at dawn, the hedgerows held the last of the night. Dew grabbed at their cuffs. Yoren cut across a field that had been sown late with a stubborn hope and waved Ned down when a movement touched the corner of his eye. The Goldcloaks were there, 4 of them, at the road's low place where dust goes to lie. They sat their horses and let their mouths work on the taste of complaint. "Stand," one said, with the deadly casualness men used to cover fear. "We've been stood all morning," Yoren said. "My feet would like to move." He did not move them. Negotiation is a dance men teach their bodies without knowing they are teaching. He leaned on his staff, which is a way of saying I will not run, which is a way of saying I have nothing you can take that is worth your trouble. It was a lie. He had a girl with a name coiled in her bones like a snake. He had a man whose face men had been paid to remember forgetting. "We're charged to," the Goldcloak began, and then the sentence went away on the air as 1,000 starlings poured over the hedge in a black seam that stitched sky to ground. The cloud of them fractured and reformed and made itself into shapes with more intention than birds should be permitted. They swooped low and turned the horse's sanity inside out. Hooves went sideways. One horse spun a desperate circle and put its rider's boot in a rut and left it there with the legs still in it. The smell of startled animals and dust filled the world. The Goldcloaks flung up arms to protect eyes they did not know how to protect from what they did not understand. Yoren took that breath, the small one the gods give a man sometimes when foolishness is in the eyes of his enemies, and pushed his little string through the gap. "Go," he said. They went. The birds burst like a thought under a sudden correction and were gone, and the hedge lowered itself back into innocuous green. The Goldcloaks stood with a mutual dislike, not at one another, but at this new category of humiliation. The one whose leg had been left behind swore with a thwarted eloquence. "What was that?" he demanded, as if Yoren owed him an explanation for the weather. "Nature," Yoren said over his shoulder. "We've had some, and I'm certain you don't keep good accounts of it." He did not look back. Men who look back at miracles ask for men to interpret them. Ned did not ask. He knew the feel of this air now, the small tug on high. Skin as if ants were climbing him, the sense that a space just behind his ear had opened. He thought of his son with his hand on a tree, and of a woman in a cell who had told him once that the gods listened best when you did not lean at them with questions. That evening, when they were finally still enough for a fire no larger than a fist, Arya watched her father's face and pretended to sharpen needle just to have a gesture to cover her thinking. "You've lied more in the last week than you did in all your years," she said, and the knife's whisper against the stone kept her words from being too solemn. "Then I have learned quickly," he said. "Are you sorry?" She did not mean the lie. She meant the leaving. She meant the not dying. He considered his answer. "I am sorry for the weight of it. I am not sorry for your ear. She frowned. My ear? That you might live to use it, he said. She made a small noise that was not laughter and not a sob. I feel wrong in my body, she admitted, and touched her head where hair had been hacked. Like a badly made chair. You will grow into it, he said, which is what fathers say, even when growth is the thing a girl is afraid of. They slept. In Winterfell, that same night, a boy dreamed he was a wolf and a wolf dreamed he was a boy, and the place where the two dreams met smelled like rotten leaves under the snow. Jojen woke later and lay with his eyes open listening to the house breathe, and he did not tell anyone the particular picture that had come to him. A river boiling under ice, a hand reaching through it to pull a white thing out, a face under the water that was not a face and that had an appetite without end. He did not tell because he had learned early that a green dream loses its shape when you say it too soon. He held it as men hold hot iron wrapped in rags. He would deliver it when it could be handled. The next days arranged themselves and were spent. They went into a village that had a well with a bucket that complained as if it were made of conscientious objectors. They shared stew with a man who had once been a sellsword and now made stools with one leg longer than the others because he liked to see people wobble. They watched a hawk beat a crow to death in the sky and felt an unpleasant thrill at how little things sometimes win by being meaner. News traveled quicker than feet. By the time Yoren's splintered company had gained the stone spines that announced the approach to the neck, men were speaking in low voices of a hand who had died and then had not died, depending on which wine had been drunk in which room. Small folk told it best, as small folk always do, with the detail touched and the truth near enough that you could smell it. Some said the birds had gone for the king himself and only his mother's screams had turned them. Some said a boy had stood on the edge of a roof and lifted his hands and the birds had come like poured water out of the sky. Some said the old gods had walked up out of the black pool under their tree and gone south in cloaks of snow that did not melt even under the king's road sun. The only thing anyone agreed on was that many crows had died, and that men had cheered it because men have a need to cheer at a death even when it is a bird's. At Winterfell, Maester Luwin kept his face carefully between belief and patience. He listened to Jojen's talk with a scientist's regard and a father's exasperation and the helpless admiration of a man recognizing a discipline not his own. You use words as if they are reeds, he said. We use them like stones. Forgive me if I do not trust your floating. Jojen only smiled with the peculiar seriousness children can manage. Stones float if there's ice to hold them, he said. It is not winter, Luwin observed pointedly. It is always winter somewhere if you put your ear to the right tree, Mira said cheerfully. Please do not put your ear to the trees, Luwin said, which made Bran look down to hide his grin. Catelyn watched them and could not help imagining her boy with two more shadows by his elbow, the way older boys acquire younger ones, and she feared and gave thanks in equal measure. If you stay, she told them, you will earn your keep twice, once with your hands and once with your talk. The first will keep the larder full and the second will keep my son from thinking himself unique. It is not healthy for sons to think themselves unique. Mira nodded solemnly. Our father says the same, she said. He adds that daughters should always think themselves unique and conduct themselves accordingly. I like your father already, Catelyn said, which loosened something inside her for one quiet minute. And then the minute passed and the weight of the morning returned to sit on her like an old aunt. Robb's banners stirred. They made a noise as familiar as a horse blowing through his lips. Men swore allegiance until the very idea of swearing allegiance grew tired and went to sit in a corner and drink. Gray wind moved through the hall like a weather front. The great John joked uneasily about a beast in a house. The beast looked him in the eye, and humor left a space and did not come back immediately. In the yard, the young men competed at being loud and brave with the showy crudeness of draft horses. In the solar, Catelyn and the Blackfish and a thin maester from Seaguard discussed exact numbers of bushels as if numbers would stop spears. A boy came with a message and stood with his cap in his hands and looked like a message himself. Catelyn took the scrap of parchment and did not open it at once. She measured its weight and thought of Varys in a cellar that smelled of peaches and of the way words can arrive having already performed their labor on your heart. She opened it finally. There was no signature. She did not need one to recognize the hand. Said only, The dead keep secrets that the living cannot, and if you would have yours kept, give nothing to the river. She burned it, then, without letting herself read it again, and told herself it had arrived late and meant nothing. But she slept that night with a peculiar stillness. When she woke, she felt the print of the letters on her skin as if she had lay upon them. In King's Landing, the Queen ordered a new iron to be made for the royal armorer, a thing that would stamp a raven with its wing broken. "We will mark what belongs to us," she said. The armorer bowed and backed away and turned the order over in his head and disliked it in a way he did not put a name to. Peter Baelish watched the courtiers cluster and break and cluster again, like starlings on an evening. "Birds," he said again to himself, and in the glimpse he gave himself of honesty, he admitted that he was putting too much confidence in the throwing of a single stone. He doubled his efforts to find a second stone. He discovered there were many stones. The trouble lay in the hands that might be induced to throw them. Varys moved through the palace like a man who had misplaced a very small thing and was turning rooms over with careful hands in search of it. He set 2 boys to serve wine in a tavern near the mud gate and paid a woman to pretend to beat them in the yard when men were drinking. He had no faith in dragons or gods. He had faith in the very old fact that a city loves a spectacle. When the Goldcloaks returned with grazes on their pride and stories about starlings, he made sure they were mocked correctly by the ones who needed to mock them and quietly given new boots by the ones who needed them to keep walking. He went sometimes to the sept and knelt and lowered his eyes in the posture of a man in prayer and made use of the septry's acoustics to hear men's whispers better. He thought of the man in the north with the shaved head and the iron coin and permitted himself a thin smile because no one in the world understands the relief of a plan that has, against expectation, not failed. Then he stopped smiling because he had learned also the stubborn habit of plans to exact interest on their successes. Ned reached the marsh country and felt a peculiar tug under his ribs. He had not known he was missing until it returned. It wasn't home. It was the feeling of being near something older than your own tragedies. The ground took on the wobble that frightens horses and delights geese. Men's voices dropped into a register that meant they had recognized another power and were trying to make their throats worthy of it. Yoren's step did not alter. He walked as if he had been walking to this spot since he was born. They were met by people you do not see until they choose to be seen. A boat slid out from behind reeds that had seemed no more than a pleasant idea and bumped the mud bank with a resigned sigh. A woman in a coat stitched with shells grinned at Arya as if she were something wonderful that had washed up. 2 boys with faces like otters watched Ned with a concentration that would have put a septon to shame. "You come as if the ground invited you," said the woman in shells. "It told us not to bring our pride," Yoren said. "We left it with a man who can take care of it and charge us for the keeping." She laughed. "Come then, the water will have you. It's always wanted a lord to sink." Ned kept his balance with stubborn dignity as the boat stepped out into the green. The marsh was a different country, one that made different laws and enforced them with a softness harder than stone. Reed men and women moved around them with the economy of creatures who do not waste gestures in a place that punishes waste. The boat rested against a jetty made of branches woven so cleverly that the water, which goes everywhere it pleases, had consented to hold them up. Jojen and Mira waited on it. Mira raised her hand. Jojen smiled the smallest bit and then looked down at Arya, and something like pleasure moved through him at being right about a small thing, in a world filled with dreadful gifts for being right about large ones. "Welcome," he said to Ned. Ned stared, then, without shame or prevarication, at the boy who had announced himself a reed and a dream. Then he looked past him to a little encampment where fires fought dampness and won in heroic small ways, and the smell of fish and coriander and peat made a dish that could not be eaten except here. "You know me," he said. "We knew you when you were a desire," Jojen said, as if he were only remarking on the weather. "We knew you when you were a trick. We know you now that you are a truth. The marsh prefers truths to tricks but understands you cannot always choose." "Does it?" Ned said. "Prefer truths?" Jojen thought. "No," he conceded. "It prefers silence. But when it must be spoken in, it prefers truths." Arya had no time for that. She had seen the loop of cord at Mira's belt and the net that was slung on it and wanted to touch both. Mira caught her looking and said, "Do you want to try it?" Arya went to her like a fish drawn to a light. "Yes," she said, breathless. "Yes." Mira put the net into her hands and then into her stance and then into her shoulders. "It's in the hips," she said in a calm voice that meant to counter Yoren's talk of early beds and long roads. "Always the hips. Men think it's in the fingers. It isn't." She showed Arya the turn. The net flew with a little thrill to it that was immediately more satisfying than the throw of a knife. "Better than a sword," Mira said lightly. Arya considered treason and found she could not commit it against Needle. "Different," she said wisely. Ned's unease sat down beside him like an old hound. He let it be. Yoren spoke with a thin woman with hair the color of a reed reflecting sky. They exchanged words that were themselves like reeds. Flexible, resilient, interlaced with water. Ned heard the name Howland Reed spoken and felt a shiver that went down to an old room. Not in Winterfell, but in a tower where a Yun Gur version of himself had held a friend's hand and listened to someone die beautifully in a lie. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, a man was there who had not been there a moment ago. He had a face that had refused to choose between kindness and craft. He looked at Ned, and in his gaze was a respect that did not bow. "My lord," Howland Reed said, and then he smiled at the expression that crossed Ned's face. "Forgive me, old words, old habits. You have put them aside. We will do the same. You are a man who is tired enough to be welcome in any house." He looked to Arya and his eyes softened. "And you are a fish that grew legs. Your mouth is still too big for your face. That will change." "Not if I can help it," Arya muttered, but she stood straighter. "You can have our reed's shadows for a time," Howland said to Yoren. "The gold men will follow the water thinking it is a path. We will let them for a while. Then we will let them discover it is a circle." He turned his head as if listening to a thing far away. "You cannot stay long. The marsh is like a generous woman. She gives and then grows bored. Best to accept the gift and go while she still likes you." They stayed one night. Ned slept as if the water made a sound that could put even shame to rest for a few hours. Arya learned nets and how to read the little ripples that move across a flat and mean a thing has moved under it. Yoren ate fish with 2 fingers and told a ribald story to a shell woman who snorted river into her bowl laughing. Howland spoke to Ned in a low voice, and though their words were quiet, the weight of them made ripples you could see if you stood on a particular angle of bank. "You saved a man who was supposed to die," Howland said. "I cannot think how to feel about that." He lifted his chin and there was affection in the angle of it. "I am glad for the boy you were and the man you are. I am worried about the water." "It was not my hand moved the birds," Ned said. "It was my boy's. I know," Howland said gently. "The marsh speaks differently when a child moves it. It is not so angry." Ned said. He wrapped the iron disc in his fist until it bit. "I have been borrowing courage from men whose business it is to lend it and charge dear. I will pay it back, Reed. I will stand a night on that wall for every bird that fell out of the sky for my life." "You will stand more nights than there were birds," Howland said, "which is as it should be." He shifted his gaze toward Arya, who slept with her mouth open and her hand near the handle of her sword. "There will be others who owe. It is not a matter for a single purse." When they left, the morning was made of silver. The marsh put a veil over them that was not a veil. The gold cloaks rode by later, and one of them remarked upon a heron with a tail that split in 2 like a forked river. His companion slapped him and told him to save his poetry for his wife. The man did not have a wife. He said nothing in answer. The marsh counted them under its breath like a child practicing his numbers. It let them go. Sansa's lessons grew harder. They tested bone. The queen spoke of gratitude until the word dulled itself. She took Sansa's hand at public times and let it drop in private, as if hands were a fashion she had grown bored with. The girl learned to swallow the dry bread of omission. She watched the small men in the court and memorized more than they meant to teach. She stood in a terrace garden one afternoon where orange trees had been tempted to grow in a city that did not deserve them, and found herself alone with Ser Marin. She did not speak. He did not. The silence had the shape of a wall. She leaned against it and did not cry. The hound came later and found her in the shadow. He looked at her face as one might look at a blade to see whether it holds an edge. "You're getting better," he said. "At what?" she asked. "Setting traps with your mouth," he said. "You make men want to talk. Be careful. They will want to show you the part of them that isn't rotten. And there is none." "There is in you," she said quietly, before she could decide whether it was wise. He laughed, a small ugly huff. "There was," he said, and put a finger on a scar as if to prove where it had gone. He leaned, abruptly, to sniff the orange blossoms. "You smell that?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Remember how to smell. It sounds foolish now. There will be days when it saves your life." Bran kept his bargains with the day. He did as Lewin liked in the morning when the light made the pages clear and the quill sure. In the afternoons he rolled himself to the yard and watched the men wrestle the practical work of carts and fences and bridles. He let summer range but not far. In the evenings he went to the godswood and put his sacrifice on the bark. A smear of blood, a confession of wanting, a promise to not ask for too much more. Sometimes the old voice in the between place spoke, said little always. Once, "You will travel in the body of a thunderstorm." Once, "You will find yourself in a stairway with no steps and learn how to climb." Once, "The price is not what you think it is." He began to wish the voice would say something ordinary, like "Do not eat the mushrooms with the brown cap." It never did. It had no appetite for the small. Mira took him to the pools by the outer wall where the castle's water came to wash its face. They hunted frogs with a boy's exacting joy and put them into a bucket and let them out again. "Why keep them at all?" Bran asked, puzzled and delighted. "To feel the catching," Mira said, and her eyes sparkled with mischief. "To see if we can do a hard thing gently." Jojen sat under a beech with leaves that had turned a thin, hard brown and watched them with a small smile that looked like sleep from a distance. When Bran looked up at him, he said, "There was a dream last night that smelled of horses and cold iron and breath. Your fath, or walks toward a door that opens on a wall that does not like his name." Bran's stomach tightened. "Will he reach it? We will have to keep catching and letting go of frogs to find out," Mira said cheerfully, before Jojen could answer. "Which is to say, some things we get to choose." At the wall, Jon Snow looked out over the endless and felt he had finally been given a thing his size. The cold pleased him. It was honest. It did not pretend to be kind and then turn cruel without apology, as men do. He cleaned Longclaw until it reflected not his face but the idea of a face, and thought of nothing in particular for a while. That nothing was a luxury in a place where men fill even the wind with stories to keep from hearing themselves die in their own imagination. Sam sat nearby and told a joke about a pig that had learned to talk. Jon laughed and did not catch all the words because the wind stole one here and there. Somewhere in the mess of talk and food and scraping and cursing, a raven spoke a word without speaking, and no one heard it except the boy who had had his hand on a tree, and a woman in a cell, and an old man whose dreams woke him smelling of cinnamon and pitch. When Ned reached the shadow of that wall, it rose as if it did not remember him and did not care to. He felt small in a way that had nothing to do with his hair or the iron disc at his throat. Yoren pounded the butt of his staff onto the frozen ground, and the sound went up along the stone like a message in a system older than bells. Gates opened grudgingly. Men came out with faces the cold had carved into opinions. The look in their eyes was like old tools, uncompromising, sharpened by use or dulled by it, but not interested in novelty. "Recruit," Yoren said, and offered Ned with the same dry tone he would have used to offer a loaf or a weapon or a lie. The old bear stood on the other side with a large man's slowness. "He doesn't look like a boy," Jeor Mormont observed. "Boys come in many shapes," Yoren said. "This one will keep his mouth shut and his body down when he ought to, which is more than can be said for most of my crop." "Name?" Mormont asked. Ned's throat tensed. To speak a name is to pull a rope. We leave them, Yoren supplied. They melt on the road. Call him stone if you like, or snow if you must. There are too many snows here already. Stone, Mormont said, with a twitch of humor like a mountain shrugging. You've had a longer road than most stones travel. We'll see if you're heavy enough to hold up a wall. He let them pass. Ned moved into the shadow and felt relief like pain. The place swallowed noise. Men's voices became hammers. He saw boys drilling, and at the edge of them a young man with a face he knew better than his own. John's laughter cut the air with a jauntiness that hurt. Ned stepped sideways, a coward's move, and Yoren put a hand on his arm briefly, and that was enough to keep him from running into or away from his own son. Later, Yoren murmured. We'll find the later that breaks clean and not the one that shatters. Ned nodded as if he had any choice at all in the matter. He learned where he would sleep and where he would think and where he would be told what to do by men he would once have called by their first names in his own hall. He learned to carry wood in small loads because that is the way to not break your back. He learned the sound the ice makes when it complains about the weight of men on it. He learned the smell of the mess and the way men lean into the smell because it makes them feel less alone. At night, he lay with his eyes open and listened to a raven say words that were not words, and he spoke his boy's name under his breath and knew that if the wall had been listening it would have heard and not cared. Bran slept badly, and in the badness of it he went high, far, beyond the simple roofs of men and the simple roads of men, and he looked down and saw a line of black like an eyelash on a cheek and knew it for the wall. He saw a bright pin of a soul there that was his father, and another that was his brother, and he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with weather. He breathed into the bark and felt his breath return to him from the stone somehow, an impossibility he did not try to argue with. In King's Landing, the queen stood at a window and held a goblet of wine so tightly that her knuckles made their case against her skin. "He's at the wall," she said, as if the city had delivered her a particular dish she had not ordered. "Let him rot." "He will," Peter murmured, not because he agreed, but because you do not argue with a woman standing with an idea as if it is a cliff. "Walls are good at that." "Yes," she said, "they keep men in, they keep men out, and they keep secrets in the middle that no one thinks to ask for." She drained the goblet and watched the light fall on the city and thought of orange blossoms and had a sudden overwhelming hatred for the tree that had dared to flower in front of her. Varys set a hand on a map and let it rest there as if it were blessing a very big child. He allowed himself one sigh. The sigh was honest. He would not have scolded himself for it if he could have. He thought of a man at a wall and his son in a castle and a girl in a city and another girl in a marsh. He thought of birds. He thought of bells. He thought of prices. He thought, very briefly, of dragons, and then shook his head, because some stories are more patient than men, and he could not be. That night, Winterfell breathed and slept and stirred, and the gods would held its slow colloquy. Bran woke twice with the taste of sap on his tongue. In the second waking, he heard it again. The not-quite voice that existed in the place you go just before you hear your own heartbeat at the inside edge of sleep. "We will ask," it said. "Ask," he said without sound. "We will not tell you when," it said. "Tell me now," he said, and then smiled into the dark at the foolishness of tea. "Ring to out-bargain trees. It will not be what you think," it said patiently. He rolled over and looked at the shape of summer in the low light. The wolf's ears told him what he could not see. He put out his hand and laid it in fur. "I know," he whispered to the wolf and the tree and the night. "I know." The marsh exhaled and forgot the footprints of 3 people and a staff. The King's Road went on doing what roads do when not watched. It prepared itself for new feet. The wall stood, a sentence written in a language that does not admit of translation. In the Red Keep, a woman slept like a clenched fist. In a northern hall, a boy woke and went to a tree. Between these things moved the old, patient arithmetic of the world. Gift, price, change. And the birds, when they rose at dawn, all rose at once, as if somewhere a small boy had lifted his hand without meaning to. They lifted into the cold and made geometry in the air that had nothing to do with men's reasons, and everything. The days that followed arranged themselves not into peace but into a pattern men could tolerate. Men tolerate patterns better than peace because patterns let them talk. Rob went south with the wolves' shadows long around him. Caitlin drifted between women's work and men's work and kept both from breaking their handles. Mira taught Arya to find fish in a place where the water lied and taught her how to lie to water, which is a better lesson. Jojen taught Bran not to ask for the dream but to be listening in the right way when it came, which is like learning to fish with your eyes shut. Yoren moved across the world like a man who had once been told the fastest way between two places is a straight line and had discovered it was a lie designed to keep you from meeting the people you need. At the wall, Ned finally looked at his son. It happened not because he had decided it should but because the accident of tasks arranged themselves so. They passed in a corridor with a wick smoking in a sconce and 3 men arguing over whether someone else had stolen the last of the onions. Jon's step paused. Ned's heart went unkind on him. The boy's eyes widened and then closed and then opened again. He was a man and yet not, and men do not cry in corridors unless the world has stopped and asked them to. "Sir," Jon said miserably to Yoren because that was the shape of his training. "Is this a man?" Yoren said. "You can ask him his name if you like, and he will give you the one he is using. Or you can walk on by and decide your heart is not interested in a test today." Jon looked at Ned. Ned looked at Jon. It was a small room that contained, for a breath, everything. Then Jon said, "Stone," and walked past. His jaw clenched as if it were the last order he had been given and the last order he would obey. Ned made a sound he did not recognize and put his hand flat to the wall. The stone took it and said nothing. "Good," Yoren said, knowing the cruelty of what he had arranged and knowing also its necessity. "That's done the way a thing should be." In the Godswood, Bran put his forehead to the heart tree and did not ask for a change. He asked only for the field to be clear of stones when men and boys walked one another's paths. The tree did not answer, or perhaps it did, and the answer is always silence when the question is one the world must answer with what it does rather than with what it says. The ravens slept with their heads under their wings. The bells waited. The birds and the bells had not finished with men, nor men with them. Above the marsh, a heron flew on legs trailing like careless thoughts, and in the Red Keep, a woman dreamed of birds that would not come when called. The wall breathed. The old things of the world turned once, slowly, like a man in his sleep. And far to the north beyond the last knowledge a boy had pressed his hand to. Snow fell in a pattern that no man could read yet, but that had already begun to arrange where feet would step and where they would slip and fall. The next morning, Robb Stark's army took the road, and Catelyn's barge put off into a river that promised not to drown her if she kept her balance and did not look overlong into its eye. Mira woke Arya with a splash of cold water and handed her a net and said, "2 fish before we eat or we starve." And Arya grinned and said, "Then we eat," and got them her fish. Ned stood on the wall and watched it dawn under his feet, and Jon came to stand beside him and said nothing, and nothing was enough. Bran sat in his chair and let the sunlight find his knees and waited. He did not hurry the day. He did not need to. He had learned at least that sometimes doing nothing is the only thing you can do that will not make a god impatient. And in the little space between doing nothing and doing something, a breath was drawn that would later be called a storm. For now it was only air. The air a boy felt when he lifted his hand as if he would call starlings and did not. The air that moved reeds. The air that moved a wolf's ear. The air that moved a ribbon of smoke from a kitchen fire where women turned bread and told stories that improved as they cooled. The air before a bell is rung, that attends without judgment, that carries sound and does not answer it. The air over a square in a city that had been made to hear the feet of many men. The air over a pool black enough to swallow a face and reflect it back older, kinder, truer. The air that keeps everything from falling upon everything else, for a while.